Hello there, I'm Charlie Elliott, and today we're going to talk about barefoot running, the literature-backed answer to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to do. So, before we begin looking at barefoot running, we're going to look at the foot first. So, we can see that this is the foot here. We've got the ligaments surrounding it, and we got the tissue, which would be our skin, surround it as well. So some things to take into consideration here is this arch just here. This arch is responsible for allowing a more economic movement and the absorption of impact when the foot hits the floor. And you can see that the bones are connected by ligaments, which allow them to move a bit more freely and able to absorb the impact, which works alongside the arch there. These bones, such as the calcaneus, work to absorb the impact and allow you to lift off a lot more easier, which work in conjunction with the phalanges over here. This joint is a very active, mobile and free moving joint almost, and very easy to move, which makes it so efficient in contrast to other joints which are a lot more harder because they are just one big bone usually, when these ones are just loads of little bones, so you can see here. So, is running barefoot a good thing or a bad thing? Well, let's look at the literature and we'll make a judgment from there. So the first one says, the barefoot runner also has a diminished stance phase and therefore less contact time with the ground, which generates smaller peak forces compared with shoed runners. This overall means that because we have a smaller stance phase, this therefore can lead to obviously a smaller ground contact time, which will in turn generate a smaller peak force. However, since barefoot runners lack heel support, impact pressure is dissipated by a flatter foot placement. This increases total surface area contact and reduces focal pressure on the heel, causing decreased load on specific ligaments and joints. So, basically, because we have less pressure on the heel, and most of the pressure is onto the foot, the front of the foot. With the front of the foot being a bigger area, it will therefore lead to a lower ground reaction force, which overall will lead to a likelihood of a decreased chance of developing an injury. Because the loading on the joints and ligaments and other connective tissues will be lower. This is because on the heel, when we land on the heel, we are likely in a locked position with our knee and our ankle, which will therefore mean that will be at a bigger risk of getting injured. Despite recent controversy, studies have indicated that habitually barefoot runners tend to adopt, in most cases, the forefoot strike or midfoot strike patterns. However, it is clear that habitually shoed runners use the rear foot strike pattern. So as we talked about here, the reason why the forefoot and the middle of the foot is a lot more efficient is because we are using our spring, which is our arch, a lot more efficiently and a lot more better the way that it should be used, because running on our heels is not a natural running form. Even if it's seen by everybody these days, it's not a natural running form. We shouldn't run like that because our body is not designed to run on the rear of our feet, because it's got so many nerve endings which stimulate pain. Comparatively, running on our front and middle, that is a lot more normal Let's say it like normal, because it should be how it's done. It should be how we should run. We should not be running on the rear of our feet. That's a complete no-no, because it locks our joints. Our knee is completely locked, and our knee is probably the most important, one of the most important joints when undergoing gait. So we need to make sure we keep that joint safe. Otherwise, we will have a diminished, poor gait. So running our front of our feet, therefore, means that knee is not locked, and therefore the pressure and the force going up the foot will be a lot more displaced, therefore decreasing the chances of injury, like we talked about. Now, this one here is really interesting. A second less well documented change in need of further research is muscle hypertrophy or conditioning. Unlike rear foot strike landing, forefoot strike landing, and midfoot strike landing places eccentric loads on the plantar flexors during the initial part of stance. Because eccentric loads generate more muscle hypertrophy than concentric loads, it is reasonable to predict that runners who forefoot strike or midfoot strike, or who transition to forefoot to midfoot gaits, have a stronger plantar flex muscle. Stronger plantar flexor muscle. So, this in simpler terms means that because we are using our muscles eccentrically via doing forefoot running on the front of our feet, this therefore places eccentric load. And if you know how muscles work, eccentric loading is the place where most micro tears take place when undergoing strength-based activities such as weightlifting, which is why that is always recommended when you are doing weightlifting to go fast concentrically and slow eccentrically, because you won't get much muscle damage doing concentric exercises. You have to do eccentric exercises, which is why the eccentric should always be stressed. So, go back to our topic. Using our muscles eccentrically places more stress on the plantar flexors, which, as you'd expect, are involved in plantar flexion in contrast to dorsiflexion. This, in turn, will mean that we'll have better ability to adapt to the ground below us, because our foot will be able to, have a better ability to smack the ground, and also be able to lift off a lot more efficiently due to having stronger plantar flexors. This also links in with our next one, which we're going to talk about. Barefoot runners have even more variable kinematics than shoe runners because they experience more proprioception from their feet. So, linking with our first one, if we have stronger plantar flexors, we're able to therefore hit the ground more economically, because we are able to adapt to the ground a bit better. This overall will mean that we are better and more efficient at running, because we will have a better ability to lift off, because we'll know how much force we need to transfer into our feet to lift us off. Compared to shoe running, you don't have this, because the shoe is working as a physical barrier between your foot and the actual ground. This therefore will lead to leg stiffness, which we'll touch on a little bit later. So Bishop et al. Studied the effects on shoes on lower limb stiffness and found that leg stiffness significantly increases when using high-cost shoes as compared to with barefoot running. This may look like it's a good thing, but it's actually a really bad thing, because as I talked about with the knee is the most important joint when undergoing gait, closely followed by the hips and ankles. Therefore, if our leg is stiff, it won't be able to absorb the impact. and this will increase our chances of developing injury. Now, what's really interesting here is that they put specifically high-cost shoes as compared with barefoot running. So this therefore suggests that high-cost shoes are actually doing harm than good. Now, this can be because high-cost shoes usually have more cushioning in them. Now, you may think this is good, but this is actually really bad, because you are more likely to heel strike if you are undergoing a rear, if you have more cushioning on your shoes, because you won't be able to feel that, because you won't have that proprioception. This is why barefoot running should be done, because it improves this and it allows us to understand how to actually run better. There's a significant difference in the observed ground reaction force between barefoot and shoed running. A barefoot or ultra minimalist shoe, which we'll talk about a little bit later, runner tends to forefoot strike, which creates a smaller collision forces and therefore generates a smaller ground reaction force than the shoed runner. The barefoot runner also has a diminished stance phase and therefore less contact time with the ground, which generates smaller peak forces compared with a shoed runner. So this almost sums everything up with that we talked about. Because we are landing in a different way, we will have a smaller ground reaction force due to the fact we've got a smaller ground contact time, and the load is going to be dissipated, shall we say, over a bigger area compared with the heel. So, in turn, running barefoot can decrease our ground reaction force and make running more safer, but there is some things that we have that we'll touch on later that might be a decider. So as an alternative to barefoot running, minimalist shoes have also gained popularity. Minimalist shoes provide a protective foot covering for tough terrain and mimic the feeling of barefoot running, but lack any kind of cushioning or support. So this, very similar to barefoot running, is basically a shoe. This is basically a shoe which is almost like running barefoot, but it's not. You see, these shoes provide a physical barrier between you and your foot and the ground, which can decrease the chances of getting infections into your feet, such as like wildflowers, for example, or stones and thorns, etc., onto your feet, which can obviously lead to cuts and hopefully not, but can lead to infections. And then last but certainly not least, although humans have been running for millions of years, the earliest records of footwear date back as recently as 40,000 years ago, prior to the invention of primitive shoes. Humans were running barefoot. So, as a natural perspective, running barefoot is a very natural thing to do, and therefore can be shown as a very good thing to do in that case, if you want to stay in the natural sort of way of things. So we've looked at the good things about barefoot running, and we've found that it's actually a really good thing to do. However, we need to take into consideration a couple of things. If you're running in an urban environment, we need to take into consideration things like packaging, which could be contaminated with the ground and stuff. We've got glass and other debris. And if you're running in the wild, or like on the grass or on the sand, you need to take into consideration obviously glass again, but also thorns and sticks and stones. So that's your decision to make up, but it's just a case of finding that area that's clear of that sort of stuff, because obviously you can do a check before you actually do the running. So the next bit is habitually shoe runners, when barefoot, for example, are more likely to rear foot strike on soft surfaces like grass, and to forefoot strike or midfoot strike when running on hard surfaces. Now, this obviously isn't a terribly bad thing, but it's not the best thing, because running on the rear of your feet, end of story, is a bad thing to do. You shouldn't do it because it slows you down and it significantly increases your cost and it increases your ground contact time. So therefore we should definitely consider adopting our forefoot or midfoot strike when running. Now, it's not a bad thing running on hard surfaces, but it should be avoided because the body is not made to run on hard surfaces. After all, we were born in the wild and we were made to, jump and run over obstacles, which is not tarmac. Not like tarmac, like we are brought into these days. We were made to run on sand and soil, not tarmac and roads, because it doesn't have any give in it. It doesn't give any energy. It just gives it all straight back to us, and we have to absorb it through our joints, ligaments and tendons. So therefore we should always try and consider running barefoot on grass, sand or mud. Now, as I said, rear foot striking is not a good thing to do, and forefoot striking is the best thing to do, but it shouldn't really be done on hard surfaces because it can lead to a scrape on the feet, which can indeed lead to cuts. Because obviously when we actually barefoot run, we're not going to stop completely. We're still going to almost slide on the hard surface, even though it's got a lot of grip in it. We're still going to almost slide in it, and it's going to cause damage to our feet. So we must avoid that wherever possible. And that's not saying go and do rear foot striking on it, because that would make no difference. So next thing to look at is increased peak pressures under the forefoot and toes are thought to increase the risk of metatarsal stress fractures if the change is done too quickly. Now this is a very interesting point actually, because you think that especially if we were running on we don't actually know exactly what surface these guys were running on, but it must be taken into consideration. If you've got brittle, weak bones, it's definitely a no-no, because you are going to have higher peak forces, especially in areas like your toes, and that could indeed lead to stress fractures, which is very important to consider. Sudden alterations in running routine have been associated with stress fractures, and the drastic change from a cushion supportive shoe to barefoot is unquestionably a significant change in running routine. So this is again the same sort of topic we were talking about. We need to do this change slowly and gently, because we will have injuries when we try barefoot running. There's no doubt about that. I've had injuries when I've been doing barefoot running, predominantly around my feet, because my ligaments and tendons were not used to stretching that much, because I've always run with shoes. It's only recently when I found out that it's actually a really good thing to do that I've actually adopted barefoot running as a part of my training. So running barefoot must be done slowly and gently and with little changes, because the supportive cushioning of shoes is unquestionably so much more easier to some extent on the body, because it absorbs the impact when we're running on tarmac predominantly. So therefore we need to be very careful. In addition, shoes with arch support presumably limit how much the arch collapses, lessening how much the arch elongates, and thus how much negative eccentric work these muscles do. Now I wish I looked at this before I got my injury, because I didn't quite know this until I read this literature. I didn't quite realise how much that the arch is not activated when wearing shoes. I knew that it was not activated a little bit, but I didn't know it was activated this much. Not activated this much, sorry. So overall, we need to be careful when barefoot running because we are likely going to be stretching our ligaments and tendons a lot more than they are used to, which indeed could lead to damage. So we need to be careful. So if you remembered, while we were talking about the good points of our barefoot running, we also touched very briefly on minimalist shoes gaining popularity. Now this is a picture of one here. This is an ultra minimalist shoe, or what we call a 5-finger shoe, which is a shoe which provides cushioning and a little bit of support when undergoing barefoot running, but most importantly, it provides the physical barrier between your foot and the ground, which means that if the floor is unpredictable by having like glass or things on it, which could lead to you slipping or foiling or getting damage to your feet, these should be considered because they will provide that physical barrier between you and the floor, which therefore can decrease your chances of getting a physical injury. Along with that, as you can see, they have a lot of grip on them, so indeed they will provide grip to your feet and therefore allow for a more efficient toe off. But these should be considered along with barefoot running and not as like a way of barefoot running if you've got any form of physical injury like ligament injuries or tendon injuries, etc., because these still won't absorb the impact as much as a proper shoe would. So these have to be considered as with barefoot running, not instead of, or like without barefoot running at all. And as I've said, these should always be done slowly and gently into your training. They shouldn't be brought in straight away and used as a substitute because especially if you're new to barefoot running, you need to get used to it as a form because your whole gait will change when you're barefoot running. There's no doubt about that. So it's very likely you need to change in a gentle way and involve barefoot running into your routine along with shoed running. Hello guys, my name is Charlie. Thank you so much for watching my first video I've made. If you don't like it, feel free to dislike it. And if you do like it, thank you so much. And do it if you want to like it. Please comment down below if you want to give me some advice about how I can improve both my channel and also my videos. And also please comment if it's good. Thank you so much for watching. Take good care of yourself and see you soon now.